Welcome to On Open Source. Conversations with thought leaders in the open source community. Brought to you by
So, Luke, Laura, why don't you give us a little bit of background about who you are and what you do, and how you guys managed to make it off the soap opera?
We escaped. It was after I fell down the stairs and lost my memory. We've been involved with PHP for about 10 years now. Luke and I started off on a project building online legal services like before the first web explosion. And we actually started off writing it in Perl, and then it was like, well, we could use PHP. It was new, it was shiny, and everybody was talking about it. So yeah, we started working with it. And then we became really frustrated because there were no good books on PHP, so we were forced to write one. Forced, yeah,
yes,
absolutely forced.
Your editors held a gun to your head and said, you must write this book or else.
That was halfway through the project, actually.
Yeah, halfway through the project.
They didn't really get it right at the start. It was only when we were behind schedule.
Yeah,
editors have a funny way of doing that.
They do.
Right? They're all sweetness and light when you sign the contract, and then, you know, then the whips and the chains and the...
You know some editors.
Yeah, I've written a couple myself. Things. And so... you wrote the book, and then you said, that's it, I'm never going to touch PHP again.
No, we said we'd never write another book. But we've been working...
Every author says that. They get done with their book, and they say, I'm never going to do it again. And you went and did another one, didn't you?
We did. The first book, PHP MySQL Web Development's like 1,100 pages now, right? We're doing the 4th edition, plug. But the other book... The second book.
Yeah, well, the advice we always give books, people always ask us whether they should write a book. And the advice we always give people is write a short book. Which, and at least we stuck to our own advice for the second one.
Yeah.
And so you went from 1,100 pages down to...
150, something like that.
MySQL tutorial. So I wanted to write a book that you could read like on the subway on the way to work and read like a chapter a day, assuming you had a short subway ride, you know, so it's short.
And this was a PHP book or a
That's a MySQL
book. Yeah. Okay. All right. And you know, you've been doing this for 10 years now.
Pretty much, yeah.
And how has the technology changed? I mean, clearly it's not the same thing as it was a decade ago.
I actually think the technology has probably changed less than the people using it and how they use it. Like 10 years ago, we really liked PHP and we wanted to use it on projects because that way we could be efficient and get it done more easily. And we'd have to like either choose to gloss over the technical details to the customer or have to sell PHP to the customer. Whereas about sort of 4 or 5 years ago, people started coming to us and say, okay, we want you to do this because we want it done in PHP. Like people started asking for PHP. And it's gone from being sort of a niche technology to being a real mainstream force.
Yeah, somebody asked me last year, you know, do you see, are you surprised by which large companies are using PHP? And I said, well, I'm surprised when they're not using it because everybody's using it. You know, it's everywhere.
Now, over the last couple of years, there's obviously been a surge of interest in Ruby and Rails.
Oh, I can rant about this.
Coming from the PHP world, you know, what's your thoughts on this? I mean, where does this fit in with the whole, you know, collection of web technologies?
May I rant on that? Yeah, so I have really strong opinions about this, and have commented on it frequently.
That was a request to rant if I ever saw one.
Please. So Ruby on Rails is interesting, and just as a bit of a disclaimer, I've been managing a Ruby on Rails project for the last 12 months, which is just for comparison, and I've ranted about it on my blog as well and elsewhere. And as another piece of background on me, I've been doing MVC programming for a long time. So before I was ever a PHP programmer, I had written MVC code in Visual C++. I had written Motif, if people even know what that is anymore. I've been doing MVC things for a really long time. Woohoo! I'm really glad somebody else does. Usually people shudder, and that's my reaction as well. So MVC is a design pattern, and it's never implemented the same way twice and all that kind of stuff. And PHP also has a bunch of frameworks that have sprung up. I hate frameworks.
I don't hate frameworks. I just think that having multiple frameworks is worse than having no frameworks.
See, I used to think that.
I'd be really happy if like Zen framework or something took off and killed off all the other ones. That'd be great. Because theoretically, like the main advantage of having a framework is there's a bunch of code that you can reuse, you can hire new staff, they already know half the libraries you're using, so you have to train them.
When there are 1,647 PHP frameworks, then you lose all those advantages, right?
And all you're left with is like sort of your application has 5,000 lines or 50,000 lines of somebody else's code in it that you don't know what 95% of it does.
They're all bloated, a lot of them are really poor code quality. So having said that, then I went and used Ruby on Rails, and it has some really good features. So there's this whole convention over configuration thing, which means that you can get started quickly and you understand how the code is laid out, which helps for maintainability. A couple of things I really don't like about Ruby on Rails is that it's opinionated software, and it's not my opinion. I'm really opinionated as well, and I just happen to not agree with the way that DHH wants to do things. I found that the community is kind of immature, which is something that will take care of itself, I think, but it's going to take a few years to grow to the level where that sort of it's and there are some pockets of it that are really good, but just like the PHP community is huge and you get really good answers to your questions. And if you say, I'm running Ruby on Rails on Solaris with Postgres, people come back to you and say, why would you want to do that? You should just use Linux and MySQL. And it's like, well, but I'm not. So that doesn't answer my question. So that's kind of the main issues with it. It's been an interesting ride though, and I think I'm always a fan of like when you're architecting any PHP project, you should build the simplest thing that could possibly work. And the problem with sort of any kind of the frameworks, if you look at somebody like Paul M. Jones who's done all these benchmarks where you're sort of pulling in all this code from the framework, is that it tends to get really slow. So, it's a trade-off that you make. But I like sort of simple, clean, performant code. Therefore, I'm not a big fan of frameworks.
Rants over, she turns to you. Your turn.
That was the short version, too. Honestly, I could talk about that for an hour on its own. So.
Do you see some similarities between PHP and Ruby and Rails?
Well, I mean, they're both like trying to solve the web problem, right? But I think they're into kind of a little bit of a different market too. PHP, I think. So it's like Java was for C++ programmers who were frustrated with all the things they didn't like in C++. Rails, Ruby on Rails, Ruby's a really nice object-oriented language. Don't get me wrong, I love Ruby, but Ruby on Rails is like for Java programmers who are disenfranchised with all the kind of J whatever. In the same way that PHP, I guess, appeal to like C programmers, like all the flexibility of C without the pointers, basically. I can go and solve the web problem and not worry about like the parts of C that allow me to hang myself. So yeah, I think that's kind of one of the similarities.
And they do appeal to different mindsets as well, I think. Like PHP is an inherently pragmatic language.
It's an engineer's language.
It appeals to pragmatic people, like people who are happy to say, okay, well, let's take this thing from over here and this thing from over here and let's slash them together with a piece of string and call it a job done if we can get that done quickly and if it'll work for us. Whereas I think Ruby appeals to people who like things to be like
elegant,
clean
and
pretty and
shiny.
And it doesn't bother them so
Big
much
fonts,
if it takes
colour
them.
gradients.
It doesn't bother them so much if it takes them sort of 4 times as long to get something going.
Right.
If the end result is prettier.
It's quick. So the project I worked on with it, we built a prototype really fast, which it's good for. But then you're kind of stuck with the prototype code, like that classic problem of being unable to discard a prototype. So, it's interesting.
Now, PHP versus, you brought up Java, Java frameworks. Advantages, disadvantages in both directions.
It's funny because it's really hard to come. They're both tools and they're both good tools for what they do. Java is great, PHP is great, Perl is great, Rails is great. All these things are great. ASP.NET's a pretty good tool, especially it's kind of improved a lot. I don't know. I don't want to say that.
Okay.
It's great. And besides, Brian will kill me if I say that. So, but I was saying, I think they appeal to different markets again, like the Rails thing. So Java is really like the if you're a bank, if you're a big enterprise, if you're like a huge shipping company, you're going to be using Java.
If you're being paid by line of code, right?
Well, there's always that. And Java. The other thing is Java programmers are a commodity. Like it's really easy to hire Java programmers. There are a lot of them. They tend to be quite middle of the road too. Like Java programmers tend not to be really bad or really good. Like there's a lot of sort of good standard. I mean, there are some fantastic ones and some really awful ones, but on average, like the bell curve has got like a really fat middle section. The PHP curve doesn't look like that. The PHP curve has like some really fantastic people and some really awful people, but it's just not as sort of concentrated in the middle. Like there's a lot more awful ones, and I think there's a lot more really good ones. It's really hard to hire them as well.
For more information, visit onpodcastweekly.com and subscribe to all our podcasts. Brought to you by the publishing imprints and information portal of Pearson Education.